One of the things that I think is really short-sighted about our, the kind of way that we think about supply management in this country is that, Canadian farmers are, yes, they benefit in the short run from having this system. And it is an implicit subsidy. The quotas that they are allotted have quite high market value. But at the same time, they do also lose out from having, poor access to foreign markets as a result of
Mm-hmm.
this system being a sticking point in Canada's global trade negotiations. And I think it's in the long term there really is the potential for Canadian farmers to benefit from selling their products not only within Canada but also abroad.
Well, I've been fascinated to see the word supply management appear so many times. And of course, it's in light of the Trump tariffs. And it's one of the clear examples of Canada putting up tariffs to prevent, well, all products, but let's say mainly US dairy and poultry products from coming into the country. So I was very pleased to be able to call again on Joseph Steinberg, one of Canada's leading experts on the tariff situation, University of Toronto economist. Joseph, thanks for finding time. I know you've had a heck of a week travel-wise trying to get back home, one of those ones affected. But maybe just start with really the Barbara Walters example or explanation of what supply management is.
Yeah, okay. So let me just say, broadly speaking, what is supply management? The basic idea is that it's a system that allows specific agricultural sectors in Canada. It is, the primary beneficiary is the dairy sector, but also the poultry sector as well. But basically, it's a system that allows specific sectors, these ones that I've mentioned, to limit the supply of their products to what the domestic economy, Canadian consumers, are expected to consume in a given year. And the idea behind this, the motivation behind this, is to, number one, ensure stable and predictable prices for consumers. We'll talk about, we'll talk about how good that is. And number two, to provide quote unquote fair incomes to farmers that produce these goods.
When did it come into play? When did they start this whole system or some variation of it?
Yeah, so supply management in Canada started back in 1970. Now, it's important to mention that prior to that, Canada did have a system of explicitly subsidizing farmers to the tune of tens of millions of dollars a year back in that time. And the government, for various reasons, decided that these kind of explicit outlays weren't feasible, weren't financially feasible, weren't politically palatable, and so they moved to this system of I would refer to it as implicit subsidies. They are not, the government is not explicitly transferring money to farmers in these sectors, but the system of supply management, and we can get into the different components of that system, amounts to, an implicit subsidy to farmers in these sectors.
And again, I'm just ballparking these things, but let's give people an idea of how much it costs sort of the average Canadian consumer. Again, if they bring in, milk products from the U.S. above the existing sort of quota number, it's a huge tariff. Off the top of my head, it's in the 250% range.
Yeah, so the tariffs on imported dairy products are in the 200 to 300% range. That's exactly right. It is. I think it's important to mention that technically, we do allow a very limited amount of tariff-free imports under the supply management system. I'm most familiar with the numbers for the dairy supply management system, by the way, which I think is by far the most impactful part of the supply management system in Canada. We do have poultry and eggs under supply management as well. I think a lot of the discussion centers around dairy for a variety of reasons. So the numbers that I'm familiar with say that about 10% of the, we allow for tariff-free imports that amount to about 10% of what Canada's domestic dairy market consumes every year. So we do allow for some dairy products imported tariff-free, but beyond that, roughly 10% quota. Everything comes in as 200 to 300%. It's not just from the United States; it's dairy products from all around the world come in at this really high tariff rate.
So the bottom line, though, is Canadian consumers are paying more, And I would say it might, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would seem to be we got a lot of sort of milk related product manufacturing going on. So if I'm a baker that use milk, or I'm making yogurt or maybe ice cream, it has an impact on those products too, besides just like a liter of milk that I'm buying.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, supply management, at least in the dairy sector, again, it raises the direct cost to consumers of buying milk at the grocery store, but also everything that involves dairy, kind of raw dairy products as an input to production. So, obvious examples are things like cheese and yogurt. But as you mentioned, there's lots of other products that use dairy, in lots of other food products that use dairy as an input. Lots of bread products, all different kinds of prepared foods. The prices of all of these things go up. So the numbers that I've seen estimated out there, I've not analyzed this directly myself, say that the average Canadian consumer is paying about $500 per year or more for dairy products than they would in the absence of the supply management system. And dairy products are particularly important for low-income households and households that have lots of children. And so, some people are claiming that on the order of 100 to 200,000 Canadian families are being pushed into poverty every year as a result of this increase in costs. So it's not negligible. In the aggregate, this amounts to something like $6 to $7 billion per year for Canadian consumers that we're kind of losing out as a result of the supply management system.
I'm glad you're also putting the spotlight on, again, who spends more, a greater percentage of their budget on necessities like food. Well, it's going to be lower income Canadians,
Yeah.
and I mean, if dream scenario, I'm making 500,000 a year, I don't change how much I'm really consuming in terms of food, but it's a very small percentage. But if I'm making
Yeah.
$50,000 a year, and we've seen the kind of price increases, 25% over 4 years for food, it's very difficult. And I just want to put the spotlight on that. So when we have this artificially increased price for our dairy and poultry, who does it impact the most is low income Canadians.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to flip that around, it's really important to mention that the beneficiaries of these
Mm-hmm.
implicit subsidies, primarily dairy farmers, they're significantly wealthier than average. So if you look at the total income, the net income that owners of dairy quotas receive, subtract off all of their production expenses, their farms are bringing in, on the order of $250,000 per year in terms of the median. Similarly, if you look at the family income of families that actually own these quotas, the quotas. And I should have said, we can. I maybe jumped ahead a little bit by mentioning quotas. By the way, if we want to go back and talk about the
Mm-hmm.
details of how the supply management system works, but I'm speaking of farming families that benefit from this system.
And
Um, their household income is again somewhere between 150 and $200,000 per year on average, and so these families are actually significantly wealthier than the typical Canadian family.
well, and as I say, I mean, in the spotlight right now, a couple of things have brought it in the spotlight, though, is some of these stories about farmers pouring out, hundreds or thousands of liters of milk because they can't increase the amount they're allowed to sell. The quota system. So it
Yeah,
discourages innovation, that's for sure. And it produces. But of course, the other side is the Trump tariffs have been the top story for a couple of months now in the country, and they well could be a sticking point. Uh, as we go forward here.
yeah. It's worth mentioning. This is not the first time that supply management has come up in the context of U.S. Canada, trade negotiations. President Trump, during his first administration, made a big deal about wanting increased access to the Canadian dairy market, and so
Hmm.
and this is something that has come up, in the context of trade negotiations with other countries as well. The European Union, New Zealand, for example. It's really been a sticking point in kind of Canada's global trade negotiations. This is not just kind of a one-off thing with President Trump, saying something. He says a lot of wild stuff about all kinds of things, where he's totally off base, by the way. But he's not the only one complaining about this, is all that I mean to say by that.
You mentioned New Zealand, which is interesting because Australia and New Zealand went through the process of dropping their supply management. And so there
Yeah.
must be some lessons to be learned there. It seems like they still have agricultural industries in both of those countries, but there are also probably some lessons. I mean, I'm certainly not in favor of saying, starting on, March 1st, we're not going to have supply management. I mean,
Yeah.
these people in good faith, the farmers in good faith have created a system, for their individual farm to participate within. So it would need to be, in my opinion, some sort of phase out phase, but I'm sure Australia and New Zealand may have some, lessons for us to have learned.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things that are important that I think are at least important to mention there. So the first one is that, one of the things that I think is really short-sighted about our, the kind of way that we think about supply management in this country is that, Canadian farmers are, yes, they benefit in the short run from having this system, and it is an implicit subsidy. The quotas that they are allotted have quite high market value, but at the same time, they do also lose out from having poor access to foreign markets as a result of this system being a sticking point in kind of Canada's global trade negotiations. And I think it's, in the long term, there really is the potential for Canadian farmers to benefit from selling their products not only within Canada, but also abroad, right? I mean, to some degree, we have that within Canada as well, right? I mean, the Quebecois dairy farmers, do not just sell for the Quebecois market; they also sell to British Columbia, Alberta, etc. Right? So to some degree, I see personally, a hint of hypocrisy there in terms of the complaints about, bringing in foreign imports of dairy products when we have some kind of internal trade in dairy as well. But I see in the long run, there's potential for some significant benefit from having access to, say, the Asian market. Broader access to selling, dairy products to China. This is especially with, the growth in these regions, Africa as well, as Africa is expected to continue to grow and get richer. Having access to these growing and much larger markets than Canada's, there's a big potential gain there. New Zealand, as you mentioned, is a great example. So New Zealand got rid of their dairy supply management system a long time ago, several decades ago. And what happened? Well, production skyrocketed, exports, went up by an order of magnitude. Farmers won out in New Zealand. They didn't lose from getting rid of this system.
I would see I think the biggest challenge, on the one hand, it'll be interesting to see what role they do play in the current negotiations over trade, et cetera, with the U.S. Your point's so well taken, though. It is costing us other market access, too. And I think people have to remember that. But Trump seems to have the headlines right now. But it's also the political obstacles. I mean, no federal party has dared say anything even about it. And nothing that we've said here today could be debated. I mean, it costs Canadians. That's what a tariff is. And is that cost justified? From a huge group, 40 plus million, to benefit a small group, but they don't even want to talk about it. So I think the obstacles are huge, and it may take the pressure of someone like the Trump administration to actually force a change.
Yeah, it's what they refer to as a political sacred cow. I mean, it's the only politician that talks about getting rid of this is Maxime Bernier, who's been, more or less written off by the political establishment as a loon. Aside from that, it's either vociferous, support for the supply management or, just kind of unwillingness to talk about it in general. There's nobody out there who's a serious politician in this country who's willing to actually, go on the record and say, look, the system is costing Canadians and we would benefit as a whole, as a country, from doing something different.
Okay.
And so
I was going to say,
let
me put you on the spot here. And I love these questions. Can you give me in 30 seconds how to solve a 50-year-old problem? But that's me. But give me a couple of things that we could at least put on the discussion table if we were going to do this.
So look, I'm an economist. I'm inclined to, be really interested in efficiency and competition. And so obviously I'm, in favor of doing what we can to try to get rid of the system. But I understand it is politically unpalatable. So let me start with, if we can't get rid of it, what could we do on the margins to actually improve it? So the big thing that I can think of off the top of my head is number one, look, these quotas that we've allocated have not been allocated in a way that is creates any kinds of incentives for farms to improve efficiency. If anything, the way that these quotas have been allocated, and as well the way that prices are set under the supply management system, discourages efficiency and innovation and creates huge barriers to entry, for people who are thinking about getting into the farming business. It protects incumbent farmers. And so in terms of these quotas, the national quotas should be auctioned off. Okay, we shouldn't just distribute them in this kind of, more or less ad hoc way that we do. They should be auctioned off in a way that allows them to be, bought up by the most efficient, lowest cost, highest quality dairy producers. You can think about this as somewhat analogous to, market for carbon permits, right? You create a market for, carbon abatement, or for pollution. The companies that end up, doing the abatement as a result of this and buying up all the permits to pollute are the ones that are, best able to cut back on their own emissions. This is, using a market like this is a good way to do it. I would also, advocate for allowing an interprovincial quota trade, right? We should shift production to the lowest cost regions. Right, we shouldn't just allocate these quotas, to each province in the way that we've done it. We can allocate these quotas nationally and allow them to be traded both within provinces, but also across provinces under a market system. In terms of, the way that prices are set, I think there's a great deal that we could do to set the prices that farmers receive for their products so as to encourage innovation and efficiency. Right now, the way that these prices are set, we basically ask farmers, how much does it cost for you to produce your product? And they tell you. And so what they tell you goes into the calculation in terms of what the price should be that they get for their product. And so right there, you can see that is essentially an implicit subsidy to farmers who are inefficient.
Yes.
Right? Farmers who are inefficient have really high costs. Those really high costs get passed right along to consumers through the price setting process. And so we should reform the way that we set prices to rely less on farmers' reports of their own costs, right? We need to have a way of assessing independently, objectively, what is the cost of producing these products under, the most efficient production system. Obviously, in terms of the tariffs, I would recommend at least, on the margin, expanding the tariff rate quotas. If we're not going to reduce the tariffs themselves, at least we could expand the amount of tariff-free products that we're allowed to import. And, we could do that especially on certain types of dairy products that, Canada produces less of. At the very least, that would give Canadian consumers, access to a wider array of varieties of imported products at reasonable prices.
Well, it's first of all, I appreciate our discussion here. It's about time it was on the discussion table that we did get more courageous. Right now, it's status quo or I'll kill you. And it's not even a budge on this kind of thing. And as I say, my point is, it's costing us, costing consumers, costing low-income families, costing us innovation. The list goes on. And I think, as you were alluding to, trade opportunities, because we're shut out of other markets because we shut them out of ours. So lots of stuff to discuss, and I appreciate you helping facilitate that. Joseph, I'm glad you're home safely. Thanks for taking time.
Absolutely, Mike. It's great talking to you as always. Looking forward to next time.